Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. Welcome, everyone. If you enjoy the show, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast listening platform and YouTube. You can now also check out the full video episode on X. Please also consider sharing your favorite episodes and leaving a review. If you do that and tag me or send me a screenshot, I will enter you in a monthly raffle for a free 30-minute consultation with me. I have two winners to announce from the prior 2 months. I went to Instagram for this one, and Jim Hill and Viviana Kolb are the winners for sharing one of the episodes to their Instagram stories. Jim, Viviana, check your DMs for ways to sign up for the free consultation. For full episode details, including notes, timestamps, transcripts, and the show Patreon page, and other ways to support the show, please head over to my website at zachbitter.com. There you can find all my coaching services, including some new offerings for 2025. You can also sign up for my Substack newsletter, where I have been publishing my training journal weekly, as well as other topic-based posts. If you have any questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on my website or at hpopodcast@gmail.com. A big thanks to Element, Delta G Ketones, Currents, and Maui Nui Venison for supporting the podcast. A full description of how I use these products can be found at the end of the episode. Discounts, promotions, and details can also be found in the show notes and at the end of the episode. All right, Matt, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I'm excited to dive into some topics with you around fat oxidation and maybe a little bit of just exercise science in general.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy to share it with the listeners as well. This is my first podcast, but I'm excited to kind of be here and I suppose maybe share some of my expertise, some of my experiences in the lab, and some of my kind of research findings as well. And hopefully they're kind of useful to your listeners and the audiences get something out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm honored that I'm the first podcast that you've done. I know it's something where I find it interesting because it's like podcasting in general has grown so much, and I guess the internet in general too sort of gives us this opportunity to jump into some areas that otherwise would maybe be a little harder to access. And I love to see that more like professors and PhDs and researchers and stuff are sort of coming out of the classroom a little bit or coming out of the lab a little bit and jumping on shows like mine to kind of let us kind of dive into your brains for a little bit and see kind of what you guys are finding out there.
Sure. Yeah, it's I think it's probably worth mentioning as well. My background, I am an academic. I work in university, and a lot of the people that probably listen to these maybe might be coaches, they might be athletes themselves. I might be lucky enough to get a few other academics, but if there's some nice practical messages that come out of our talks, that hopefully is beneficial to people that are listening, maybe implement things that they're going to do in their own training or coaching as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some of all of that tune into this podcast. So we'll get the word out. Maybe we should kick things off with a little bit about kind of what you do, where you work, and things like that. If you don't mind, just giving us like a brief introduction as to kind of your day-to-day responsibilities.
Yeah, so I'm an academic, but I work in a university in the UK called the University of Worcester. I think Worcester's probably famous for a Worcestershire sauce. Everyone obviously has a difficulty in pronouncing that, but in terms of like kind of where that is in the UK, we're north of Birmingham. We're north of London, but we are south of Birmingham, so kind of in the Midlands of the country. I've worked at this university now for 8.5 years, and I teach sport and exercise science on kind of undergraduate degrees, master's degrees of different types. But my research interests kind of exercise physiology, sports nutrition, and I've done quite a lot of work on the effects of blackcurrant and its effects on exercise physiology responses, metabolic responses during exercise. We've done some cardiovascular work as well. So that's kind of my background here at Worcester. I suppose before I joined Worcester, I was a PhD student, and I did my PhD at the University of Chichester. And again, on that PhD, we spent time looking at the effects of blackcurrant again on physiological responses and stuff. So, yeah, I've probably spent the best part of 10, 11 years now on blackcurrant and its effects on physiology.
Very cool. And that's definitely something I want to dive into with you at some point during our conversation here today, because that's something I've been using since the start of this year. So it's always cool to see kind of the research and the science behind it, and kind of get an idea of like what possibly is going on.
Yes.
It's just fun stuff for sure. But kind of the overall topic that I want to chat with you about too is just kind of like fat oxidation in general, and maybe a little more specifically how that pertains to like exercise and exercise performance and things like that. So maybe we kick things off with just a little bit about just what if the listener's just kind of thinking, okay, I'm going out for this run or this ride or this endurance activity, my body's using fuel to power that. What is like the fat oxidation part of that, and why is that maybe relevant for someone who's going out for a run in the morning or a bike ride or swim or something like that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to take this quite broadly. On metabolism, we, we consume three energy substrates: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And we can metabolize all of those for the production of energy. And that energy we can then use for exercise. Now, measuring protein metabolism can be done, but it's quite difficult. But also, it only produces a very small contribution of energy to our overall metabolism. So we kind of always tend to really focus on the other two. So carbohydrate use and fat use during exercise. And we call those carbohydrate and fat oxidation. But essentially, when we are at rest, we metabolize mostly fat with a very small contribution of carbohydrate to our overall energy expenditure. But if you then go out on a run or cycle or any form of exercise, your oxidation rate of those substrates is typically tied to the intensity of the exercise. So as you increase the intensity, your carbohydrate utilization tends to increase in a very linear fashion. Pretty much, well, it will go all the way up until when you can hit your maximum oxygen uptake, which is also known as your VO2 max. But your fat oxidation, your fat utilization tends to increase in like almost an inverted U or an N shape, so that at very low intensities of exercise or rest, there's fat utilization, but it's at quite a low level. And then as exercise intensity increases, typically to around moderate intensity, which we would say maybe 55, 65% of your VO2 max, that's when it tends to peak. And then there's a bit of variability in that. Some people are able to get a higher percentage of their VO2 max. Some people are a bit lower. It depends on diet, training status, etc. I'm sure we can talk about those in a bit. But once you've kind of hit that peak, it then tends to drop quite quickly. So that by the time you're at VO2 max, or very near VO2 max, your fat oxidation is pretty much zero. And in an exercise physiology lab, we can easily measure this. It's very difficult to kind of measure this in the field, almost impossible unless you've got any kind of respiratory kit. And the reason we do it with respiratory equipment in an exercise phys lab is because you're going to need the amount of oxygen people use and the amount of carbon dioxide they produce and the volume of gas that they breathe in and out of their lungs. And then with a series of equations, you can then work out how much carbohydrate and fat people are using during exercise. I suppose the other piece of information that people need to know as well is that while we consume those foods in our diets, we also store energy. And I'm going to focus on fat and carbohydrate here. Carbohydrates are stored in muscle and in our liver as glycogen. Essentially, this is, if you were to look at it under a microscope, it's lots of molecules of carbohydrate attached together. And what that does is it provides a store of carbohydrate. And when we undertake prolonged exercise, that store as glycogen can get broken down to help fuel the activity. Now that store is typically limited. Most people probably around 90 minutes to 2 hours of moderate to hard exercise, and you're probably starting to deplete your glycogen stores. Now, on the other flip side of that is your fat stores. Even for very lean athletes, you're typically talking almost unlimited stores of fat. And those are that's the kind of interplay. That's the balance, I suppose, that people strike when you're doing endurance activity, in that you don't typically want to run out of muscle glycogen because it's useful for very high intense efforts, thinking like sprint finishes or trying to sustain high speeds or high power outputs, versus lower speeds where you're maybe using more fats and not going fast enough to maybe win a race. So there's that difficult balancing act that elite athletes and people have all the time. Does that make sense? You happy?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent foundation to kind of base the conversation off. I'll just ask or maybe confirm in the case of just the fat oxidation side of things. You mentioned kind of that U-shaped curve of fat oxidation. For listeners, if I'm understanding you correctly, that's absolute fat utilization versus a percentage of your energy needs is where that U-shaped curve is being shaped versus like at rest, the fat oxidation percentage is likely quite high and then is going to possibly go down in a more linear fashion over the course of that aerobic intensity spectrum, whereas your total fat utilization is going to increase once you hit that 65% VO2 max, give or take, depending on the individual lifestyle factors, will start to come down as your body demands more carbohydrate for the intensity being produced.
Yeah, I probably should clarify that. Yeah, so I'm saying when you measure it and you record it as an absolute amount, so grams per minute. There are different ways in which you can report it, like milligrams per kilo of fat-free mass, etc. But in our lab, we tend to just go with the equations for grams per minute, essentially, rather than, as you point out, that percentage to overall energy expenditure. You can work that out that way as well, but that's typically when you're doing a fat max intensity protocol. You would like to know your maximal fat oxidation rate, and that rate is provided in absolute terms, so grams per minute. And we say grams per minute. It's typically not many grams. It's normally for most individuals. Should we take a broad sweeping stroke of people who are athletically fit? You're probably looking at 0.5, 0.6 grams per minute. So it's not a massive amount per minute. But then when you think about over many minutes of exercise, that starts to add up. So yeah, it's absolute terms.
Yeah, no, it's good. That's a good follow up. And then yeah, we're talking about essentially 9 kilocalories per gram there from fat. So those minutes pile up to become a portion of whatever your energy expenditure is going to be. And like you said, that can add up. And it's worth looking at too, because I think with well, especially nowadays when we have like a lot more people entering endurance athletes, and then one of the big questions they often ask is, well, how should I fuel these things? Like, what do I need to do? And that ranges greatly from people who are doing next to nothing to people who are trying to eat as much as possible and maybe not paying attention to whether it's fats or carbohydrates or not, and then everything in between. So I always tell people that like you can start kind of getting yourself into some ballpark figures by kind of addressing it the way that we've kind of talked about it so far, which is like the intensity is going to determine heavily that demand. There's going to be a piece of that equation of just what is the duration you're out there for, because if you're out there for a very short period of time that's very intense, you're also not likely to dip into that liver or muscle glycogen in a way that could be exhaustive versus like something like a half marathon or a marathon where you very much you're going to be lower on that intensity spectrum. So your gram per minute utilization of carbohydrates might be lower, but that compounds over a much longer period of time. You can find yourself in trouble, and then it gets a little more interesting. So, in the past, what I've done for races too is I'll just go in and get a metabolic heart test done and just see kind of where my fat oxidation rate is across that spectrum of intensity up to VO2 max, and then kind of figure out like, well, based on the race intensity I'm doing, what is where does that fall from like a pace at intensity standpoint, and then I can sort of get an idea of just the ratios of carbs to fat that my body's demanding at the intensity I'll be asking it to perform at, and that gives me a little bit of an idea of like, okay, how much carbohydrate should I be taking in order to defend that exhaustible side of the equation.
Yeah, that sounds like a typical approach. A lot of the people that we get into our exercise physiology lab that are paying for like a lactate threshold or VO2 max tests, typically they're combined. When I kind of write those reports up for individuals, I do give a slight insight into their carbohydrate and fat usage during exercise. It's not a traditional fat max test where the conditions where you measure your maximal fat oxidation rate and the intensity of your or the intensity of exercise where that occurs, that's typically done under quite strict pre visit or pre-experimental conditions. Typically, you want people kind of 12 hours fasted, so doing it first thing in the morning. Typically, no caffeine, which tends to be a problem for a lot of people. Most people are often a little bit upset that you ask them to come into the lab without any morning coffee, etc. No exercise the day before, well rested, etc., etc. So if you're doing those types of tests to get an idea of your fat oxidation rate and your fueling strategies, that's really good if you're an endurance athlete, because it does help feed into that fueling strategy and kind of, as you say, the intensities that you kind of hold for various energy substrate usage.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, and I've been fortunate to have access to some of that stuff. I think it's getting more and more accessible as universities open up their departments for people to come in and pay to get that test done. Or now here in the States, we've got a lot more just kind of like private services that offer that sort of a thing too. So people can go in and get those tests done and kind of have that blueprint available to them, and maybe start building out a strategy just a little more specific to them at the individual level. But if someone's not in that position, is there like some population level markers that we can maybe use as a starting point? Where the one I oftentimes think of is like, I believe like based on what we know, if someone is like at their aerobic threshold, someone on like say a moderate carbohydrate diet or around there is probably going to be about a 50-50 split between fats and carbohydrates.
As far as I'm aware, it is quite variable. However, if you are, if, let's say you were to use a 3-zone model, below, between, and above lactate threshold, you would assume that if you are below lactate threshold, the vast majority of your energy is coming from probably fats. It's that between point where you probably start to see that shift, and then above your lactate threshold, or above lactate threshold 2, you would typically start to probably transition into a high carbohydrate usage. Now, again, I'm using scientific terms there, but if you've got access to a lactate analyzer, and they are maybe a bit more portable, you can buy relatively cheap units, take them to a basic gym or take them trackside, etc., and then measure your pace at different speeds. That might then give you an indication. It won't give you the absolute terms and grams a minute, but it certainly gives you an idea of paces and then probably a flavor of where those different energy substrates might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. And I kind of like looking at like a 3 zone chart there just for a simplicity sake for people who are like trying to wrap their heads around this for the first time. And it's the other way I sometimes will look at that is if we take those thresholds and we look at those as the crossover points between me or easy into moderate and moderate into hard along the aerobic intensity spectrum. I think people can kind of appreciate the sensation they get when the run starts going from just like, I feel like I could do this forever to, okay, this is still sustainable, but I'm focusing a lot more, or this is sustainable, but I'm focusing a lot more. It's like, okay, now I have to focus pretty hard to maintain this. If I go any faster, things maybe start getting shaky. And, people tend to, the body's good at sending signals when you start getting into those areas. And as a coach, I always like to kind of teach people about like using all the other tools that maybe feel a little more objective, like heart rate or field tests that determine kind of things like paces for certain durations and things like that. Or if they have it, metabolic cart testing and things like that to kind of give them something to pin those sensations onto, and then allowing them kind of learn their perceived effort at a little bit more of a finely tuned way. Um, but then it kind of gets into the stuff that we're talking about too. It's like, what does that mean from a fueling standpoint? So it sounds like what you're saying is like when we're in that easy category, we can assume pretty safely that the majority of the metabolism is coming from fat. If we skip over that middle section and go into that third zone, we can be pretty certain it's going to be a majority carbohydrate. And it's that spot in the middle where there's a lot of individual variability.
If you want to make a broad brushstroke statement, I would suggest for for the vast majority of people that will be fine. Yeah,
At least from a point of I know nothing to now I know something.
yeah, that's fine. That's
You
fair.
can always
Yeah,
dip deeper though.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I mean, in terms of variability, if you were to come at exercise for the first time, or so sorry, if you were to come at training for the first time, where you want to improve in a sport or get ready for a specific event, then that approach might work. But as you become more highly trained, a a training response that you see is that people tend to get better at oxidizing fat, so that their fat oxidation rate and potentially the intensity of where their maximal fat oxidation rate occurs can both increase. Diet is another one that can bring about certain changes very quickly, but for for people who are kind of on a fitness journey or undertaking structured training, those numbers can change over time. So even if you take a measurement, that's great, but we often find that doing repeated measures, let's say every 2 or 3 months, can help you monitor your training as well, rather than just taking a single snapshot in time. And and from a kind of coaching viewpoint, that then becomes very important um, to ensure that the training is working.
Mm-hmm. No, that's an excellent point, and it also kind of lends us towards kind of like the meat of the topic at hand that I want to chat with you about, which is just kind of fat oxidation rates and how we manipulate those or how they change given kind of lifestyle factors and things like that. So like I think that's a great spot to start with. Like, yeah, let's say someone was deciding to start going on a journey to train for a marathon, an ultra marathon, a triathlon, or something like that, and they went in and got that test done at the early stage. They got that baseline data. That is all going to be, at least as it pertains to like the fat oxidation rate side of things, going to be a moving target that they now have like their initial starting point, and they can use that as like an assessment of like, okay, here's where I started. I'm going to put these different practices, whether it be the training or the nutrition, into place. Then maybe I go back and, like you said, test 3 months down the road and see, okay, what did that do? What did that training input, the lifestyle, nutrition stuff that I did do to influence that one way or the other? And I think that kind of leads us into kind of the topic of like, what are the different things that do change that? And maybe if we can put a little bit of weight onto the ones that are going to move the needle more versus less, and then maybe broadly speaking, what are the opportunity costs for that? Because I like to look at a lot of these things as opportunity, especially when it comes to the nutrition side of this. It's like,
Yeah.
I see that as like the really big lever in terms of like, I really want to jack my fat oxidation rates up. I can just drop the carbohydrate down, replace it with fat, and my body's going to jack the fat oxidation rates way up. But then what's the opportunity cost there? Is that going to give me a scenario where, sure, I'm a fat burning machine, but now when I go out and do short intervals, I'm going to be operating at X percentage lower capacity than I would otherwise. So is my trade off of improved fat oxidation beneficial to the degree that it can make up for that performance reduction I may experience later on in the intensity versus um, just being a little more gradual with that approach and trying to sort of get a little bit of best of both worlds, perhaps improve the fat oxidation rates, but also maintain the high end performance side of things too. So um, maybe we jump into those things if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, happy to do so. There's quite a few questions and directions, I suppose, that can go
Yeah, I
there.
put a lot out on the table there.
Yeah. I'm happy to start with, this idea of, as you say, increasing fat station. Does that have an effect on performance? And you can dig into the literature and you can have a look at, some studies will show an effect, some studies don't. I suppose that is the nature of sport and exercise science research. Again, not just in variability of individuals, there's variability in results. And we're not always blessed with having availability in elite athletes. There's a few papers that I know of where they've changed diets in different. So they changed diets of elite athletes and had a look at the outcomes for things like race performance, specifically race walking, and their fat oxidation rate. And it's not surprising if you give a high fat diet for a period of a few days, you tend to see a very quick change in fat oxidation rate. So that tends to go up. But that can be at the expense, especially in elite athletes, where their their performance is then potentially affected. They've often then got a higher oxygen cost to the activity. Their heart rates can be a little bit higher during the activity as well. And what we call their rating of perceived exertion, their RPE, can also be higher. We're talking about elite athletes here. And there's one paper I specifically think of. I roll it out every year to my undergraduate sports nutrition students. And it was a paper that essentially tried different diets in elite race walkers. And they showed that the high fat diet, as I said, had all those responses. But the athlete's performance was decreased, as I said. But on the high carbohydrate diet, they kind of improved over a training program to the amount that they would kind of typically expect. The one thing I always take from that paper is I get the students to read actually how fast people are race walking,
Yeah, yeah.
and you look at it and think that's not possible. Now, I'm going to use kilometers an hour. I'm not sure what it is in miles an hour, but race walkers, I think they're walking at around about 16 kilometers an hour, which is about, I think in the United States that we're about 10 miles an hour. Try walking at that speed. It's impressive.
Yeah.
So, part of that is biomechanics and technique and lots and lots of training. But, even though they are still walking, they are walking at an incredible speed. And, they're still at they're obviously high performance athletes. So training and diet have a big influence, I suppose, on the overall topic or the overall question that we initially asked. What has the biggest bang for your buck? Well, your dietary intake will have the quickest changes. So if you eat a high fat diet for a few days, that tends to increase fat oxidation quite quickly. Or even if you undertake training in a fasted state, and this was some, again, nice research in sport and exercise science where people undertake training in a fasted state. So you train low. And what that does is it helps bring about training adaptations for endurance performance by increasing mitochondrial biogenesis. This is the generation of new mitochondria inside of muscles. Now, to help people understand what a mitochondria is, that's essentially a little organelle, or a little organ, if you like, inside of a muscle where we metabolize glucose or carbohydrates and fats. And by doing endurance training, you increase your number of those. But they were able to show that by changing your diet or changing your food intake in and around training sessions, you can increase or help to upregulate those processes. Now, it's important that they didn't do them all the time. They were part of a, I suppose, a training program. But you would typically see, if you were to go out on a training session in a fasted state, your fat oxidation would typically be higher because you've likely got less availability or lower carbohydrate stores available anyway. So that's what you can, that's kind of what people, elite athletes, endurance athletes will undertake. And they kind of call this carbohydrate periodization, whereby then when they undertake a performance event, let's say a Tour de France stage or a marathon, then they will compete in a state of high carbohydrate availability so that they are getting all the adaptations from that train low situation. But then when they're competing is with high carbohydrate. Another thing that is classically known to very acutely affect fat oxidation is caffeine. And that's, that also kind of relates to why I said earlier today, when we get people in the lab, if you're doing a fat max test, we ask you not to consume caffeine, please. But caffeine is known to increase lipolysis, and lipolysis is the breakdown of fats, of stored fats. So that then leads to an increase in fat oxidation rate. So essentially, if you were to go out in a fasted training state with caffeine, the caffeine might perk you up a little bit. You might get a slight benefit then from the consumption of that caffeine, but you would be in a fasted state with a likely higher fat oxidation rate. I get that's probably quite a long answer to your question, but is it kind of go along the lines of what you wanted?
Yeah, no, I think it does. I think like the way I oftentimes try to summarize some of this is if we look for the big levers of improving fat oxidation rate, their trade-off to pulling that big lever heavily is oftentimes going to come at some sort of expense to performance at least at least in some scenarios. At least we're looking at like Olympic distance for sure, or like the study you referenced with the race walkers. I would 100% agree. Like the biggest like PR issue with that study was the fact that it said race walkers on it. But I actually had Evan Dunphy on the podcast, who is one of the participants in that study, and just unpacked his training protocol and the paces and the intensities that they're hitting. And it's insane. Like he does workouts walking where he gets his heart rate up into the 180s. So it's like, I'm doing like straight up VO2 max short intervals running to get my heart rate up that high. So it's like from an intensity standpoint, like these individuals are definitely like they're not just like, walking around the block, I guess is maybe what the perception would be when someone sees the title of that. But it the way I think about it is like if we want to pull some of those bigger levers, we just have a greater risk of there being an opportunity cost somewhere versus some of these smaller levers that they maybe don't look like they're going to be like these big needle movers on fat oxidation rates. They tend to have less trade-offs when it comes to things like how our body is going to access and utilize carbohydrates. Um, so then maybe do we look at it as like how many of these littler or smaller levers can we kind of pull and sort of create an environment of good enough fat oxidation rates, but not at the expense of our body's utilization of carbohydrate. And maybe that would include like manipulation of when you're eating your carbohydrates, like what you mentioned in terms of going out for like a fasted run versus a fed run and things like that, and being strategic with it, where it's like, hey, I'm doing an easy run that's going to be below the aerobic threshold. Maybe I don't need carbohydrate supplementation in order to execute the quality that I'm looking for out of that session, versus I'm heading to the track and doing, intervals. Therefore, maybe that's one I avoid doing my fasted training sessions for, because that has a higher quality consequence if I don't execute properly. And it's just a more difficult session to execute. So, um, is that kind of the direction that you're thinking that this is going to some degree?
Uh, I would say so. I mean, we're discussing all these points with very much uh, a, a viewpoint from an endurance athlete.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're an athlete that undertakes a team sport, soccer, football, hockey, rugby, etc., you're going to need endurance components from aerobic pathways and anaerobic pathways, and you're going to need some strength components. So to try and bring about, changes in those individuals, what you're trying to do is concurrent training. You're developing adaptations to their sport that relate to both strength and aerobic developments as well. And sport and exercise science and sports nutrition always tends to gravitate, I feel, back towards endurance sports, because they are so much more easy to categorize in terms of performance change. Do a time trial. Please complete this distance in the least possible time. Whereas a team sport, you might have had, the best game of your life, but you might not have won as a team. So, sports nutrition always, as I said, tends to, and sports science tends to gravitate back to these endurance type sports, which is kind of what this glycogen sparing fat oxidation tends to relate very well to, because it's much easier to relate to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes sense. There's definitely going to be some variance from sports to sports and things like that. And to my knowledge, like when we look at the research, there's maybe some evidence
Right.
that like even ketogenic diets would be potentially beneficial in certain sports like gymnastics, where they're doing very explosive things, but they're for very brief periods of time. And then there's also like a power weight ratio component there that is maybe influenced by that, but yeah, I mean that just is for any for no other reason other than to share, like, yeah, I'm obviously biased towards endurance sport, and the research seems like it is as well. But there is a lot more to be considered if someone is listening to this and they're thinking, hey, is this just a plug and play for what I'm doing out on the soccer field, or in a rugby scenario or something like that?
Difficult. If you are doing, team sports, as I said, there's that concurrent type training approach whereby you'll be doing strength and conditioning work. You want strength adaptations. You want strength, power, and speed, but you also need some aerobic developments as well. Now, if you were to go out and do, let's say you're a team sport athlete and you go out and do these fasted training sessions and stuff, that they're not typically associated with those types of sports and those types of training sessions. It is more your endurance athletes that we look at, and where those studies, as I've said, tend to relate to. Um, and what the challenges you've always got as a team sport athlete is that essentially you're trying to develop two different things: strength, power, and speed alongside aerobic developments are different pathways. They're different um, adaptations. So you've got to do two different types of training essentially to develop, you know, beneficial fitness gains for those sports. Whereas endurance athletes, it's very easy to measure changes in that sport, and typically the vast majority of the training, there will be some conditioning, but the vast majority is undertaking the sport that you are competing in, whether that is cycling, running, or rowing.
Mhm. Just a quick reminder that Element Electrolytes is my go-to electrolyte source. They are offering a free sample pack with purchase for all HPO listeners at drinklmnt.com/HPO. They also just launched a new flavor, lemonade. Check it out risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee. Also, check out my full description of how I use Element at the end of the episode. Delta G ketones is my go-to exogenous ketone source. You can get 20% off at deltagketones.com when you use promo code BITTER20. Currents is a product I use pre-workout and during events to help with blood flow, recovery, and fat oxidation. Check out currentsusa.com, that's CURRANZUSA.com, to see the 40 plus studies they have and use promo code BITTER20DEAL for 20% off your first purchase. Maui Nui venison is one of my favorite protein sources. The reason, they have balanced an invasive species, the axis deer, that is devastating to the Maui habitat if not kept in check, all while providing some of the most nutrient-dense meat source you will find. Consider letting them know that you heard of them from me by taking a look at their website at mauinuivenison.com/bitter.
Awesome. Yeah, the other kind of thing I wanted to just ask you about a little bit too is like when it comes to, if we kind of just go back to endurance sport, I think even within this we have like quite a bit of variability, especially as like ultra marathons are getting more popular, and then like the multi-day stuff is starting to grow too, where now we have like quite a bit more attention on these races that sometimes take 2 or 3 days. Or I just had this guy on the podcast recently, Phil Gore, who set the world record for this last man standing type competition where he made it up to like within an hour of the 5th day. So it's like, when we even in endurance sport, we've got this sort of like lumping of wide ranges of like, you could go to Olympic distance stuff all the way up to these multi-day ultras. And for that, I find interesting because I think to some degree we're still in that same spot where you said, where it's like the training inputs aren't drastically different. Maybe if you get up to like some of these really long like through hiking type projects and stuff like that, it could be different. But generally speaking, even with multi-day ultra marathon runners, I think there's a big benefit of them spending a good portion of training just developing themselves as kind of as a runner. And then all the same kind of priorities and inputs are going to be there. And then maybe spend like a block of time getting more specific to their event as a whole, which is going to be where the wide variety is between, say, like the pace someone's doing for a 5K, 10K marathon, or a 24-hour multi-day ultra marathon or something like that. But where I think it gets a little bit interesting then is like on like competition day fueling strategies, because that's where you're going to have some of that variance, where now all of a sudden we've got a scenario where the person's intensity is so low, they may find themselves in that category of intensity where fat oxidation is quite a bit higher, or the majority of the metabolism, versus someone running a shorter endurance race where they're in that other end of the spectrum from the aerobic intensity side of things. So that's where the conversation sometimes goes when it comes to fueling. So it's like you have this like question of, well, how many grams per hour should I be taking in during a race of carbohydrate? And that's where I think it gets a little bit more interesting from an intensity standpoint, from the race duration that they plan on going, and then the workload that they're going to be doing on a per hourly basis, because once you get into the longer stuff, you have to deal with potential digestive issues as being a limiter as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, as we kind of talked about earlier in the podcast, the intensity is very closely related to the oxidation rate of your carbohydrate. And as I mentioned as well, you've got a very finite store of your carbohydrate stores. If you were to go out at a particularly high intensity, 70, 80% of your VO2 max, most individuals could probably run out of stored carbohydrate within 2 hours. And that would be glycogen depletion. So essentially, you then got no fuel stores to help with any kind of high intensity effort parts of any race. So that's where, as you say, fueling strategies become crucial. Now, if you look at multi-stage events, which are typically very high intensity. Let's take, it's on at the moment, the Tour de France. Those guys some of them are consuming well over 100 grams of carbohydrate an hour. But that's not surprising when you actually look at the power outputs that some of these guys are producing, and they're up at 300-400 watts for an hour of cycling power. Now that is a huge energy expenditure, and to sustain that high intensity of activity, they need a lot of carbohydrate. And it is an ultra endurance event, but it's in a much higher intensity than, let's say, some of the running events that you mentioned, where you've got multiple days, or you've got to do maybe 100 miles. You've got that. If you're running at a slightly lower intensity, then hopefully you're keeping back, you're sparing some of those glycogen stores, but fueling strategies will become important. Now, if you are starting to consume carbohydrate 2 or 3 hours into the event, I would suggest that's probably too late. All the advice I tend to give people when I work in sports nutrition is you should start kind of throughout. If you start your feeding 3-4 hours into a 6 or 7 hour event, that's probably a bit late, and you won't be able to turn the tide on that. But what you're looking to do is obviously delay fatigue. Essentially, you'll by the consumption of carbohydrate or fueling throughout. Now, the amount of fuel you'll need, that is dependent on the individual, the sport, the intensity, and also, as you said, what you can tolerate. Now, if you're going to try and stick 100 grams of carbohydrate in per hour, most individuals will really struggle with that. And you need to actually undertake a process of training the digestive system so you don't end up with gut issues. So you get you get distress essentially by consuming that much carbohydrate. So people, elite athletes will undertake training, as it were, to make sure that they can process those huge amounts of carbohydrate. Now, for us who are not elite athletes, I would always suggest that you make sure you've tried your nutritional strategy in training before you ever go and do it in a race, because you don't want gastrointestinal distress, a third or halfway into your event. And that fueling strategy, stick with it. If you've got the data, if you've got the guidance, if you know that you're going to be getting through 1 gram of carbohydrate per minute, well, that's obviously 60 grams in an hour. Well, then that might give you a really good idea of how much you should be consuming across the hour. And 1 gram a minute of carbohydrate is not that's probably a sensible amount of the people would probably metabolize. If you go back to that fat max curve, we talked about fat oxidation rate. As I said, carbohydrate oxidation rate is linked to intensity. And depending on the intensity you're running or cycling or any activity, you can have people oxidizing 2.5, 3, 4 grams of carbohydrate a minute. And you suddenly start to see, well, this 90-minute store of glycogen, you can eat into that. And 90 minutes is, very, very achievable to deplete that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That was a lot of great stuff there. And I think it just, it references like being very aware of the task at hand, and then like your workload rate, where we look at the Tour de France, which is one of my favorite examples here, because it's like you said, it's got that blend of ultra marathon in it, because it's was it 30 days? It's like, they're out there doing, and they got like a couple days in there that they're not doing a race, but it's like the energy output for those guys are like somewhere in the neighborhood of like 6,000 calories a day during the competition. And because it's like spaced up in like what ends up just being like a gigantic interval session over multiple weeks, you have that scenario where you can maintain way higher power outputs, but for longer durations of time, just like you'd be able to do if you did a short interval session. You could tolerate the intensity that for a higher amount of volume than if you just tried to do all that work in a straight shot. So that changes the metabolism, and it also changes. The other thing I find interesting about it is like some of those stages are long enough too, where it's like, I wonder with like some of those really high fueling strategies where these guys are hitting up to like 150 grams per hour, how much benefit they're getting from, they're getting off that bike at the end of that stage with, compared to what maybe we would have seen from fueling in that cohort historically. They have a whole meal in their stomach already getting processed and ready for that next day. And when you have that really tight window from one day to the next, and then compounding that day after day, that is going to add up to be like a consequential piece of the puzzle too. So a lot of moving parts with like the Tour de France and things like that. But yeah, then when we bring it back down to what you were saying, where it's like now we have maybe a single day ultra marathon that's done at a low intensity, but still, 24 hours in duration potentially. I think like looking at workload is important, because you take the person, say we take a 100-mile ultra marathon race, the person who wins that race is going to finish roughly twice as fast as the last person who crosses the finish line within the cutoff. And when you look at that, it's like they both covered 100 miles. They probably both had a similar amount of energy expenditure over the course of that 100 miles, but one person had half the time to account for that energy expenditure, whereas the other person had 2x the time. So when you get the front of the pack going 100, 110, maybe 120 plus grams of carbohydrate per hour, what does that mean for someone who's middle to the back of the pack? And like you said, maybe that's going to be getting you a little bit closer to that like 1 gram per minute versus 2-3 grams per minute.
I think it's also important to recognize as well that when those athletes are consuming 100 plus grams of carbohydrate per hour, I'm guessing you've probably covered this in your podcast before, but they will not just be consuming carbohydrate from what we call one source. It'll be carbohydrates where you utilize multiple transporters within the digestive system. So typically things like glucose and then fructose, they tend to be absorbed in a 2-to-1 ratio. So you can get up to, 90, maybe 100 grams of carbohydrate consumption per hour by combining both of those in that 2-to-1 ratio, glucose to fructose. And that's what you will typically find that those athletes are doing. Versus if you need a lot less per hour, if you're maybe 30, 40, 60 grams an hour, there's questions as to whether you would need multiple transporter carbohydrates in that event, where you might just get away with something like glucose.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my favorite, I'm going to slightly digress, but one of my favorite activities to do is get my undergraduate students to make their own sports drinks. And we ended up, if we've got bags of dextrose, we've got fructose, maltodextrin, whatever, and we get them to actually weigh it out and then mix it with water, and they can try it. Now, typically we do it unflavored, so it's very, very sweet water, or you can sometimes put a bit of fruit squash in there. But then they get the sense then of actually what it's like to try and consume that amount of carbohydrate. Oh, and then you have to exercise as well. That's the challenge. So, yeah, it's a nice experience that the students, I think, tend to remember. And also it gives you an idea as well that actually when you measure out, let's say 60 grams of carbohydrate, and you put it on a set of scales, it's actually quite a surprising amount. And then when you think, well, some people are consuming double that, it's very surprising.
Yeah. It gets into the logistics and then the digestion of the whole process when you start looking at it into those higher numbers for sure. One thing I wanted to kind of follow up on too, because you mentioned, I think is really an interesting topic, maybe a little more important for the longer duration ultra marathon style events, but when it comes to like the fueling strategy, you mentioned that like waiting too long, like 3-4 hours in, is probably too late. You've maybe gotten yourself into a little bit of a hole that's going to be difficult, not impossible to dig out of. Is there any evidence that you should delay carbohydrate consumption, say like for breakfast before an event like that, and maybe in the early stages of the race, to potentially start off with higher fat oxidation rates and possibly maintain them, and then start that fueling process maybe 30, 40 minutes into the race versus kind of at the start line or having like a really carbohydrate dense breakfast, assuming we're doing a morning start here?
Yeah. The short answer is I don't know. However, it's important to potentially recognize that when I say you've got fat and carbohydrate metabolism, when you're at rest, 85, 90, 95% of your energy is coming from fat. But as soon as you start exercising, as I said, there's an increase almost linearly in carbohydrate use during exercise. So I would suggest that, even if you're delaying it by 30 minutes, you're already using carbohydrate source as soon as you started exercising. Even if you've got a higher fat oxidation rate, there's still some use of. So that fueling strategy, if it got delayed slightly, then that's fine. I suppose maybe there is a caveat to that. If people wake up in the morning, they're nervous, anxious, etc., and you don't want a particularly heavy breakfast, then maybe if you tried avoiding something that's got lots of fiber in it, it's difficult to digest before you start the event. That would be probably the advice I would give there. Easy to digest, high carbohydrate foods, things like fruit juice might be something to consider to just get some carbs on board before you start that ultra event. But, I accept that everybody's got different kind of race day routines, strategies, and things that work for them. So, yeah, it is ultimately probably down to the individual as well.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm sure also just that probably just like all this stuff plays into the demands of the individual within that event too, where probably a higher risk for someone pushing the front of the pack that are going to be getting up to that 90 plus gram intake need to be starting with any sort of potential reduction in that versus a person who can kind of stay maybe a little bit on that lower side or closer to that gram per minute side of things with that too. Um, yeah, maybe it's a good time just to kind of jump into some of the other stuff around fat oxidation rates and how those maybe are impacted from both like dietary or supplementary type processes. We talked about caffeine a little bit there earlier in terms of that being something that will increase fat oxidation rates. Is is that something where if a person is like, all right, I'm going to leverage caffeine in my event for the reduction in perceived effort, can they kind of follow the protocols that are in place for that and just assume, all right, I'm also going to kind of get a free extra there with improved fat oxidation rates? Or is there like a separate protocol that maybe maximizes that needs to be considered?
And there's quite a lot to work through there again. I think it goes back to the point I made earlier. If you're going to do something on race day,
Practice it.
make sure you try it in training first. Don't try it for the very first time on race day. Caffeine is a classic ergogenic aid in sports nutrition. It's one of your big three: carbohydrate, caffeine, and creatine. And caffeine known to increase endurance and sprint power events, but also has effects, psychologically and metabolically as well. So, as I said, it does increase fat oxidation use. If you are naive to consumption of caffeine, so when I say naive, you're somebody that really doesn't typically consume it at all, I wouldn't, as I said, do this for the very first time on race day. And also be careful. You might not be the type of person that would benefit from the consumption of caffeine because there's some of the gels or caffeine supplements that you can buy do contain quite a lot of caffeine. But if you're an individual that consumes it, a lower amount per day, or you would probably see a benefit. Although, I know it's not the topic of this podcast, that there is, data out there to suggest those that respond really well somewhat, and then a low, no responders at all to caffeine. And that's an entirely different topic or conversation, responders and non-responders to supplements. I think part of your question as well was also, what other supplements or processes can people do to increase fat oxidation? And I'm happy at this point to talk about some of the work that I did on my PhD.
Yeah.
And I still research on today. And that's, we've given people doses of blackcurrant over a period of 7 days. And then we measure in the exercise physiology lab their fat oxidation during a variety of different activities. So we've done treadmill walking, we've done cycling at different intensities, and we're able to show that the consumption of a concentrated blackcurrant extract is able to increase people's fat oxidation rate. Now, again, the findings are quite variable, a bit like caffeine or any nutritional supplement. Some people respond a lot, some people not so much. But I can think of about 16, potentially 17 studies now that have investigated the effect of blackcurrant on fat and carbohydrate use during exercise. And there's about 8, 9 of those studies that show an increase in fat oxidation rate from the consumption of blackcurrant. Now, some of the kind of consistent findings that we've shown are that, and I know that the companies support your podcast, Currants. So they're a blackcurrant company that provide New Zealand blackcurrant in the form of capsules. And we've shown that if you take that, as I said, for 7 days before exercise, that tends to increase your fat oxidation rate. And we've done a little bit of work on dose response as well, seeing because athletes love to do this. Oh, more must be better.
Yeah.
So therefore they take lots more than they potentially need. We've done a little bit of dose response work, and we've tended to show that the consumption of 2 capsules of blackcurrant, which contains around about 200 milligrams of anthocyanins, and I'll come on to what those are in a minute if we've got time. Yeah. But that tends to be the kind of active ingredient that we think is having this effect on increasing fat oxidation via blackcurrant.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think it's like anytime we get into the world of supplementation, we have to probably share with people. It's like the research on a lot of supplements is what it is, but then you also have the marketing side of it too, where it's like, okay, well, this product showed in this study to do this, therefore I'm going to put that in my product. And then you have to get to the dosing of it and whether they actually used a substantial enough amount to actually do what the research showed. I think we see this with like exogenous ketones and things like that too, where, the dose is very much going to be important when it comes to the results that we see in any of the research, positive or negative. But yeah, with the blackcurrants, it's a question I had about that is like we have like this potential increase in fat oxidation rate from taking that. Is there like a time frame in which like those 2 capsules are going to be beneficial before you would have to sort of re-up in order to kind of maintain those benefits? I'm thinking like outside of the realm of I'm going to do a workout this morning. In that scenario, I probably take 2 and then be done with it versus now I'm out on a race that I'm going to be out there all day. Do I take more after say like 4 hours, 5 hours or something like that?
Again, a really nice, interesting question. And I
That
suppose
there's
the
no
answer to
to.
that is, well, the answer in sports nutrition, or seems to be in science, is it always depends. Now, blackcurrant is a berry fruit. I suppose at this point, it's probably worthwhile actually explaining what
Sure.
blackcurrant is for people who are listening that might not know. Blackcurrant is a berry. In the United States, you're probably very familiar with blueberries. But blackcurrant is not as prevalent in the United States. And that's because back in the 1900s, there was a federal ban on the the growing of blackcurrant bushes because it had a fungus that attacked a certain type of tree that would then potentially affect the United States wood availability. However, that ban in certain states and stuff, I believe, is starting to be lifted. But the key kind of part of the blackcurrant is it's a bit like blueberries. They've got active ingredients in them that we're really interested in, and those are the polyphenols. And those are the molecules that provide anti-inflammatory, antioxidant properties, but they are the molecules that give our fruits and vegetables that vast variety of colors that we typically see. So, blueberries, strawberries, blackberries, they are all high in polyphenols. Now, the one then in blackcurrant that we're specifically interested in is anthocyanins. And it's important to recognize that blueberries, blackcurrants, strawberries, they all have anthocyanins in them, but there is different types of anthocyanins and there's different amounts. So blackcurrant has a very high concentration of anthocyanins in them. And all the research work that we've done has used blackcurrants from New Zealand. So I suppose if you speak to anybody that grows grapes for making wine, they'll probably tell you where those grapes are grown influences the taste, the flavor of the wine. Now, in our example, we, as I've said, have used blackcurrants from New Zealand, and that's because New Zealand is exposed to very high levels of ultraviolet radiation from the sun. So essentially, the anthocyanins are almost the solar protection, if you like, the sun cream for the blackcurrants. So they've got a high concentration of anthocyanins in them. And that's what we've used in all our research work. Now, kind of relating to your question about, do you take it and then take it again, or what are the kind of time course changes? Polyphenols in general have what's known as a very poor bioavailability. To make the numbers easy, let's say you consumed 100 milligrams. You would not see all 100 milligrams appear in the blood. You would see a lot of different metabolites. All of those metabolites would never necessarily always add up to the number 100. Some of it seems to disappear and go elsewhere. We don't quite know where. But it's those metabolites that we think are the causal reason why we tend to see these physiological responses. So those metabolites, they're only really present in the blood for sometimes a few hours. There are some papers that show that you might find the odd metabolite still around 12 or 24 hours later, but most of it tends to be gone quite quickly. And that probably relates to a lot of our dosing and duration response work. A lot of our work has been very applied in nature. So we've looked at different durations of intake, different doses of intake. I've already talked a bit about dose, but the duration stuff, we've shown that people seem to need to take it for a few days to start seeing these beneficial effects. Now, if you say you've taken it just before a training session and that was a very acute dose and you only took it one time, you may not, I would say, see the benefits. You may not get the associated benefits that we've observed. We have shown an increase in exercise performance in a variety of different type modalities, whether that be cycling or running. But again, they were all dosed for 7 days. And the fat oxidation effects, again, duration response papers have shown that, again, you need to take it for 7 days to see those benefits. It's not like caffeine where you can just stick it in 90 minutes later, you get the benefits. It seems to be something you need to take for a few days to get that benefit. Now, whether that relates to the bioavailability of those polyphenols, some sort of accumulation, I don't have a good answer. We don't know. But it's I think, an interesting future area of research that will probably start to unpick that. And what are the kind of causal reasons for why we see changes in fat oxidation from blackcurrant? Why does it need to be 7 days? Those are very simple questions, but I get the sense the answer to those is going to be quite complex, and we'll need a few studies to determine those.
Yeah. No, that's great to hear, kind of, because like with all this stuff, when we have something that's relatively new and promising, it's like we have the answers to certain things, and then a bunch of questions that we want to have the answer to that we have to wait for. And or to a degree, we got evidence, I should say, versus answers. And the thing that, so like based on kind of like what you've seen, it sounds like if someone is looking to implement that protocol, they're better to worry about just getting on that 7-day trajectory towards whatever event they want to manipulate with that input, versus worrying about reintroduction during the event so much. Maybe there's something there, but we don't have the answers to that yet. But we do know 7 days seems to be a good protocol. So if your key workout or your key race is 7 days away, start today, and then do the 7 days leading in.
Yeah. I think it's also important to recognize as well that the blackcurrant supplement I've used in my research, it has been a spray dried powder, if you like, and it's encapsulated. Now, the reason that's important, people eat fruits and vegetables as part of their diet, and polyphenols will be in those fruits and vegetables. But to get the kind of doses of anthocyanins that we're using, you almost need to eat an abnormal amount, or a silly portion size, if you like, of blackcurrant. And that's going to come with it associated problems with things like fiber, potentially flavor of the actual product, and or availability of actually being able to, buy that amount. Now, supplements tend to work really well for that, whereby you can have a consistent dose. You can consume it any time of the year. Blackcurrants, being a berry fruit, are known to grow in the summer and late summer, especially in the UK. And in January, for example, when it's winter months, you wouldn't be able to pick blackcurrants, so you wouldn't be able to eat them naturally. But if you're consuming it from a supplement type source, where you then can get the dose of anthocyanins, as you said, you can dose it in the run up to races, for the week or so before your event. And you could do that any time of the year. So that's a benefit, as a consumer to consuming or to taking blackcurrant supplements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. I think that is the value of the concentrates that you can get from some of this stuff is, fiber being something where there's definitely benefits to fiber, but the threshold is such that if you go too heavy in it, especially when we're talking about sport competition and things like that, you end up creating a bigger problem than potentially the solution you're going to make up for it with. So yeah, we want to be mindful of that sort of stuff. Do you know by offhand, like how much, like maybe in weight, how many blackcurrant berries would be required to get up to 200 anthocyanins if they were to just try to eat that much?
Yeah, I think it depends on the variety,
Okay.
where they grow,
And the sunlight stuff you
now,
were saying too, the concentration may vary.
yeah, the number I had in my brain was about equivalent to about 80 blackcurrants.
Okay.
And I remember a time in my PhD, I took garden peas, frozen garden peas. They're similar size. And I ended up counting out 80 of these things just to see what that would look like in terms of like a portion size. And then when you say, well, that's kind of potentially one capsule. So when you start doing 2 or 3 or 4 capsules in some of these studies, you look at that. I know I use garden peas, but it gives you an idea of the volume. It would be a lot of fruit to consume in one go, let alone over a period of a few days. And that, I suppose, is, the benefit, as we say, of concentrated versions of supplements. You only have to look at things like the beetroot juice research.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to try and consume the equivalent number of beetroots to get the the nitrate dose, you'd be consuming a lot of beetroot.
Yeah.
And that comes with it, again, other challenges. And the same would be true from blackcurrant. It's difficult to consume that amount. It is possible, I presume, with a bit of food processing, if it's spray dried or freeze dried powders, or even turned to juice, that then makes the consumption of those a lot easier for the individual. But we've all used blackcurrant capsules, easy to consume, no taste. And a lot of the work that we've done has been able to use placebos as well. So because they're in capsules, it's sourcing and getting a same shape, color, size placebo capsule has been very easy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we've done in our work typically.
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting too, because there's other like friction points when it comes to looking at like just building it into your diet versus something as simple as taking a capsule or something like that too, where one, you have the bioavailability of whatever you're trying to get with that amount of fiber along for the ride. It's likely that you may reduce that in terms of like it may not be something where you're getting the same bioavailability as you increase that amount of fiber with it. The other thing I find really interesting about this topic in general is just I had Dr. Mark Bubbs on for a series of episodes that's yet to be released, but one topic that came up was like he works with a lot of professional athletes, like NBA basketball players and just like top tier athletes, where you would imagine like everything is dialed. And he said like when they get traveling and they have all these other things going on, like you'd be surprised how easy it is for them to like just start to like make compromises on things. So the more friction you add to the process, the less sustainable people tend to be. So like if I'm sitting there and picking up, juicing, blending, pulverizing, whatever, like tons and tons of black currants versus the pretty easy process of taking into capsules, I'm probably making less mistakes along the way in terms of just kind of not doing it because I run out of time or I'm traveling and I don't have access to the blender the way I do at home and all these other things that kind of go into it. So there's a lot to be considered with that, I suppose.
It reminds me what you described there. It reminds me of it's almost like a catchphrase, and I think I've seen this as a title of a paper as well. But it's a food first approach, but not food only.
Yeah.
So you need to use supplements as and where you can, where there's evidence based to suggest that they work, where they whether that's the timing, total, and type of those supplements, in relation to performance and stuff, to bring about the outcome from whatever supplement it is that you want. And I suppose it's important as well that whatever supplement you are putting in place to whatever regime, whether that, as you say, is very tightly controlled, dialed in, there needs to be evidence that supplement works. So essentially, that's really a kind of an important message, I suppose, with athletes. You don't want to necessarily get in something that's going to be ergolytic and have a negative response on performance, recovery, or health. It's got to be ergogenic in some regard. With that regard on blackcurrant, I know we've focused a lot on fat oxidation, but we have seen other changes as well. I've mentioned a few studies that have looked at exercise performance, but we've also done a bit of work on cardiovascular changes.
Mm-hmm.
So having a look at the cardiac output or femoral artery diameter. So we were able to get people on a rig, get them to an isometric contraction, and then measure femoral artery diameter. So I suppose the message might be that it's similar to beetroot, that it helps to increase blood flow. And blood flow might be one of the associated mechanisms that are causing an increase in fat oxidation from taking the blackcurrant. It's a possible mechanism, but there are probably others as well due to some of the uptake of metabolites and stuff downstream. So it's not just a one physiological response supplement. We've seen quite a few different physiological responses, everything from, we've touched upon it here as well, but, gut issues and gut distress, especially in the heat. Athletes tend to get a few more issues with gut distress. We've shown, or other research groups have shown that taking blackcurrant helps to reduce gut stress. And there's even been some work on recovery as well. If you think of a lot of the recovery supplements, you class one as protein, but there is even some of the vitamin supplements, etc., people take to try and help with some of the oxidative damage that has occurred in exercise. And that relates very much, again, to some of the antioxidant mechanisms that you get from blackcurrant. So I think it's a really exciting time for blackcurrant research, because it very much relates to this podcast. Well, we've got changes in substrate use during exercise, but we've got cardiovascular changes. We've got some studies showing changes in exercise performance. All of those studies have typically been done in young, fit, healthy individuals. There are some people that are known to struggle with things like fat oxidation. If you think of people who might be overweight or have obesity, people who've got type 2 diabetes, they're known to have altered fat oxidation, insofar as it's not it's not in a good place. It's not in a good state. I'd love to know what happens if you can give this supplement that's been shown to work in exercise with young, fit, healthy individuals into those populations as well, and kind of take it into kind of more clinical findings. I think that could be quite an exciting future direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lot of moving parts with the blackcurrants from my assessment. I think just looking at it was one of the reasons why I got curious about using it, because it's like there are a lot of supplements on the market, and eventually you have to kind of like ask yourself, what's the cost benefit of any of these things? So, a lot of times when I consider whether I'm going to take one or not, I'm looking at, well, is there one very small thing this is doing, or are there multiple things that are all directionally important for what I'm trying to do? So like some of your research and just the research in general around it that kind of pointed to things like increased fat oxidation, increased blood flow, digestive things. These are three like relatively important contributors towards the things I'm going to experience on race day and then in training and things like that. So I thought, hey, this is probably something that's worth exploring a little bit more. I did want to follow up though on the digestive side of things. Is what do we know about the driver there? Is that potentially the blood flow too? Just if you have better blood flow going into the digestive system, it's easing that process. Or is there something else that we think is specific with blackcurrants that is helping with that process from just like an integrity standpoint in digestion? Or
Yeah, so this was not my research paper, but it was one of my research collaborators' papers. I'm also not an expert in the gut, but as I understand it, especially in warm environments, athletes get a condition called a leaky gut, and essentially it means that things start passing over the digestive membranes in the gut a little bit more easily, and then that can lead to gastrointestinal distress, potentially at either end. And I don't know the underpinning mechanism, but the study that I know of was taking people through a protocol in a heat chamber, and that they were exposed to hot conditions with and without blackcurrant, and measuring of gastrointestinal distress symptoms. And they showed that the blackcurrant reduced those symptoms. As I said, again, I don't know the mechanisms, but I suspect they are all interrelated.
sure.
Whether it's anti-inflammatory, antioxidants, partial blood flow, potential upregulation of certain genes, etc., might all be contributing factors.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like it seems like as nice as it would be if there was just one major contributing factor to any of this stuff, it tends to often be multiple things, or if there aren't multiple things all contributing, then the signal isn't great enough to be very important. So, which just makes it more hard for you to kind of answer some of the questions that guys like I have.
You know what though? I think it makes it a very exciting time though for that research. You've got a supplement that's relatively new. I mean, we started our work 10 years ago, or just over 10 years ago actually now. But we started with some very basic exercise physiology studies. We looked at changes in the lactate curve, and again we showed that blackcurrant had a change in the lactate curve. That then led us to questions around substrate utilization. If there's changes in substrate utilization, does that then have effects on exercise or endurance performance? So that's kind of our next natural steps. And then you start questioning and you dive into the literature and you have a look at some of the other known physiological responses for polyphenols. So then start looking at things like blood flow. And then it takes you off in so many different directions. And there are so many different studies that have been done now in different circumstances. As I said, exercise performance, some supporting recovery, some looking at substrate utilization. And now actually when we look at 10, 11 years down the line, we now start to build up quite a body of literature. There's quite a few papers on, as I said, substrate utilization. I definitely know of about 15, 16. A lot of those are in cohorts. Some are case studies. But the future, I think, is going to be very exciting for blackcurrant and or antecedent research, because another simple question could be, well, blueberries, cherries, strawberries, these have all got antioxidants. They've got different profiles of antioxidants and different amounts. Can you get different physiological responses from taking different berries? Is there an optimal dose of each one to bring about different physiological responses? I don't know. I'm speculating, but I think it makes quite an exciting opportunity in the future for different directions. But all I can talk about is really what we found now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's exciting. It'll be fun to see what comes out of all of it when we continue to answer some of those questions. But Matt, I want to be sensitive of your time and the generosity you've given with explaining some of this stuff to me and diving into fat ox and blackcurrants and all this sort of stuff. But before I let you go, I did want to give you a chance to, if you have something else you want to chat about, or if not, where people can kind of find you, check into your research, if you have any websites or anything like that where people can kind of dive into that stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm available on all the normal platforms, so ResearchGain, LinkedIn. You can find my profile quite easily from my university. If you type Matthew Cook, University of Worcester, UK, you'll find my profile. It's got a list of all my publications, and on that profile page for my university is also my contact details. And if there are academics out there listening or other people who are also interested, want advice, etc., who might be athletes, use my contact details, reach out. I'm happy to collaborate where, there might be interesting case studies or advice that I could give, or even if you've got testimonials where you've taken something and it shows to have worked. I love to hear those, because it's nice to get my findings outside of a research environment into an applied environment. So yeah, that's where you can find me online, as it were, and my research. And if people are desperate to read a paper, I'm happy to share those. Just reach out, and I'm happy to share my work. But thank you also for having me. As I said, it was my first podcast, but hopefully, the messages have been useful to the listeners, and getting the message out there as well about some of the work we're doing on blackcurrant.
Awesome. Yeah, no, my pleasure having you on. It was great. You sounded like a seasoned veteran to me, so props on that. But I'll definitely I'll link that stuff to the show notes too. So if listeners want to head over to some of that stuff, you can find links directly to it in the show notes. And hopefully further the conversation for those who are interested.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care.
Thanks for sticking around and listening to how I use the show sponsors. Maui Nui Venison is a product I discovered last year. What caught my eye was their quality and business model. They have paired the need to manage an invasive species with providing some of the most nutrient-dense meat you will find. The axis deer arrived in Maui in single digits but grew fast and have damaged the local ecosystem, and if left unchecked, are projected to reach up to 200,000 in number in future years. Maui Nui decided to solve this problem and minimize waste. Axis deer meat provides 43% of your daily value of protein in just 107 calories and boasts a 1.5 to 1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which is the most balanced ratio of any red meat. This same 107 calories provides 22% of your daily value of vitamins and 37% of your daily value of minerals. They have a wide range of products including ground venison, leg medallions, rib chops, strip loin, loin fillets, and loin chops. They also make a beef stick that includes an option with organ meats, which makes a perfect protein-packed snack that I will usually have in the afternoon before a strength session. I've also been enjoying the ground venison for dinner, usually paired with steamed vegetables or a sweet potato. You can find a bunch of recipes and ways to prepare their products on their website at mauinuivenison.com. Element Electrolytes is my go-to electrolyte supplement. Based on my electrolyte loss rate of 614 milligrams per liter, I begin my day with half a packet of one of their hot beverage flavors with my morning coffee. I rotate through all of them, but my favorite at the moment is the chocolate mint. Later in the day, I have been having either a packet of their watermelon flavor or a can of Element Sparkling, which is their carbonated electrolyte drink. I usually have the black cherry lime or watermelon flavor for those. If you are curious about how to dial in your own fluid and electrolyte setup, check out episode 300 of this podcast, where I dive into some of the things you can do at home to gauge how much fluid and electrolytes you may need. A free sample pack with your first purchase can be found at drinklmnt.com/HPO. Delta G ketones is the best researched exogenous ketone supplement on the market. The research on exogenous ketones is constantly evolving. Delta G is responsible for much of it, hosting 50 plus published studies and 20 plus ongoing studies, and have received DARPA grants designed for special forces. Delta G uses ketone esters, which is unmatched in raising blood ketone levels when matched per gram. The best use case, as the evidence currently stands, is as a post-workout supplement for better recovery and or during longer, lower intensity sessions to help with mental focus. For this reason, I will have a bottle of Delta G Performance, that's the little blue bottle, after my biggest workouts for the week and during long run training sessions once I have been out running for about 45 to 60 minutes. Head over to deltagketones.com and enter BITTER20 for 20% off your next purchase. Currants, which is spelled Curranz, is a pre-workout supplement that I started using this year based on the mounting evidence that has started pointing towards them as being a potential endurance workout supplement that can help move the needle on things like recovery, blood flow, fat oxidation rate, reduce muscle damage, etc. They have 40 plus studies on their website if you want to check those out. The way I use this product is when I wake up in the morning, I usually have a cup of coffee and some electrolytes and just start my day getting hydrated. And while I'm doing that, I'll have a couple capsules of Currants along with that. And then I get out for my first workout. If I'm doing something a little bit longer, like a really long ultra-specific long run or an ultra-marathon race or something like that, where I'm going to be out there for multiple hours, I'll usually have another capsule or two every 4 hours while out there doing that. So I'm excited to see what this can possibly do for some of the races I got coming up this year. If you want to check them out and some of the research that they have, head over to currantsusa.com. That's CURRANZUSA.com. And don't forget to plug in the promo code BITTER20DEAL, which will get you 20% off your first purchase. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.